Over the past decade, Armenia, an ethnically homogeneous country in the South Caucasus, has made remarkable progress in developing local self-government mechanisms. Since 2011, local authorities have been able to reform their political structures in cooperation with civil society. To understand what local governments can look like in practice, the European Center for Kurdish Studies, as part of the Yes for Peace project, organized a study trip to Armenia in cooperation with Yerevan State University. How has Armenia's decentralization process developed? What mechanisms have been introduced to enable young people and women to participate in decision-making processes at the local level? What can we learn from this process for Syria? In order to find answers to these questions, the participants of the study trip met with academics, political decision-makers, community leaders, and civil society actors.
In terms of power sharing, Armenia is a quite interesting example because they had this reform on the local level. That is, they restructured their communities in order to allow more decision-making and more integration of young people and women. And we think that this is an interesting example for Syria, where also a new form of power sharing is needed in order to have a more democratic Syria in the future.
The first day was spent at Yerevan State University, where we learned that Armenia's decentralization reform was a top-down reform, which focused on creating larger and more effective municipalities that could provide better services and take on greater budgetary responsibility. The main strategy of decentralization, focused on merging municipalities, was implemented by the Ministry of Territorial Administration and Infrastructure. As such, the various municipalities were not directly involved in the design or implementation strategy of the reforms. No referendums were held in the municipalities that were to be merged, and the municipal leaders could not be elected themselves. Only 6 municipalities did not participate in the expansion framework. The cities of Yerevan, Gyumri, as well as 4 municipalities where recognized minorities live. The latter were allowed to decide for themselves whether to consolidate or remain an independent municipality. Interestingly, the decentralization process and the expansion of powers were initially preceded by an enlargement of the municipalities, in effect, a kind of centralization. Armenia now has 71 municipalities, compared to 915 at the beginning of the decentralization process. Once we had gained a solid understanding of the fundamentals of the Armenian decentralization process, we engaged in discussions on youth participation with a diverse group of speakers from the university. We learned that the merging of municipalities resulted in larger budgets, allowing for increased funding for social services, infrastructure, and initiatives that benefit young people and women. Furthermore, the expanded municipalities now have a dedicated budget for projects proposed by citizens themselves. The second day began with a trip to the Assyrian Verin Dvin community, where we met with community leader Ludmila Petrova and Nikodem Yuchanayev, priest of the Holy Apostolic Catholic Assyrian Church. The Assyrian community in Verin Dvin is a non-consolidated community, meaning it chose not to join a larger municipality. This decision was made to preserve its local culture and traditions. According to Ludmila Petrova and Nikodem Yuchanayev, Verin Dvin has indeed succeeded in maintaining its cultural uniqueness. However, the choice not to merge has also had negative consequences, particularly with regards to finances. Nikodem Yuchanayev nonetheless praised the central government's treatment of minorities. Armenia protects our rights, he explained. There's even an Assyrian representative in parliament. In the afternoon, we listened to a panel discussion on the topic of multiculturalism and polyethnicity in local self-government. Muraz Shamoyan, chairman of the Yazidi Center for Human Rights, explained that the Yazidi community in Armenia receives financial support from the central government, and the Yazidi language is a recognized minority language in Armenia, in addition to Kurdish. This surprised some of our participants, as Kurdish and Yazidi are linguistically identical. Luzin Karatian, a member of the Committee of Experts of the European Charter for Regional Minority Languages, clarified Armenia's position on language rights. Armenia ratified the Charter in 2022 and committed itself to promoting all minority languages within the country. If a minority requests that its language be recognized as a minority language, it is not within the state's competence to determine whether that language is distinct from other minority languages. Luzin Karatian also commented on the challenges facing Armenian policy in the field of minority languages and school education.
Still do have teaching of languages, at least for the minorities recognized under the charter, whose languages Armenia took obligations to protect, and those would be Kurdish, Yazidi, Assyrian, Russian, and Greek. For Russian, for example, there are almost no issues related to education, but for smaller minorities, particularly for minorities that do not have well-developed educational systems themselves and like language training themselves, it's much harder, but still it is provided at school level. Unfortunately, teacher training is still lagging behind and more efforts need in this.
On the third day, we visited the Yazidi community in al-Assad, a consolidated and enlarged municipality. Unlike the Assyrian community in Verindvin, the residents of al-Assad were not consulted about whether they wished to be part of the consolidation process. Today, around 4,000 Yazidis live across 11 settlements in al-Assad. Each settlement provides schooling and public services, and schools offer Kurdish language classes. However, consolidation has also resulted in many smaller communities, including Yazidi ones, losing seats in the local council, which has contributed to a feeling of reduced representation. Despite this, representatives of the Yazidi minority stated that they were satisfied with the central government's treatment of their community. Afterwards, we visited the nearby Yazidi temple. The project participants were impressed by how freely Yazidis can practice their religion, openly and without restriction, despite it not being a recognized scriptural faith. This stood in stark contrast to the situation in their own country, especially in light of the current transitional government under Ahmed al-Sharaa and the massacres of the Druze population in Syria last July, making the prospect of freedom of worship feel out of reach. In the afternoon, we traveled to Gyumri, Armenia's second largest city, located in the northwest of the country. There, we met with Valia Martirosyan from the Youth Initiative Center, an NGO that organizes projects, volunteer opportunities, and study trips for young people aged 13 to 35, while also providing spaces for young people to develop and implement their own initiatives.
Specifically, the youth houses that we are operating in different regions of Armenia are one of the main mechanisms that we support young people to come together and to use this platform for initiating different projects and initiating or carrying out their initiatives, also using the space and its opportunities and its resources. Other than that, we also have many programs that support little initiatives. For example, we give micro-grants or we give sub-grants to young people, also to youth organizations and youth groups to implement really small-scale programs that are directed to the problems, to the issues in their communities, starting from environmental problems, finished with trainings for soft skills with other young people.
The YIC is funded by UNICEF, the Armenian government, and donations from the Armenian diaspora. On the last day of the study trip, we visited the Vanatsor region, located 60 kilometers east of Gyumri, where we met with representatives of the municipal council. Although Armenia does not formally apply gender quotas in municipal elections, Vanatsor seems to have implemented a special rule. Every third council member, equivalent to 30%, must be a woman. If a female council member resigns, her seat cannot be filled by a male candidate. On the last evening, we reflected on the past days and shared our impressions. As part of the lessons learned session, all participants discussed which aspect of the trip had been particularly striking and which elements of Armenia's decentralization process appear to be interesting for the Syrian context. Senior expert Dr. Zoran Kyle opened the discussion with a concluding remark.
So, every country is unique. You can't copy what Armenia has done for Syria. I think that's very important to say. Having said this, however, I think there are important lessons Syria can learn. One of the things that I think Syria can learn is this combination of functionality and budget increase. The importance to say, I want to incentivize local reform by increasing budgets. Make it attractive. Make it visible for citizens that enlargement is good for you because your municipality now has more money. Right? So I think that's a very important positive message. I also think the German and Swiss supported installation of citizen offices, both in the community headquarters, but also in the smaller settlements that have now been merged, was very important because it meant that citizens didn't feel, oh, now my municipal office is 30, 40 kilometers away, but they still had an office, a desk, a computer where they could go and where they can receive information, pay taxes, speak to a council member. So I think this idea to say we are not only merging, but we're trying to also bring municipal and government services close to the people. I think that's also an important lesson.
Zoran Kyle and the workshop participants agreed that, unlike in Armenia, decentralization in Syria must be a bottom-up process, meaning it should begin at the grassroots level in villages and towns and gradually extend upward. At the same time, as in Armenia, decentralization in Syria should emphasize strengthening participation and representation for all segments of society, while also providing women and young people with access to political office, decision-making frameworks, and advisory boards. Another key finding of our trip was the fact that the local level offers significant potential for involving citizens in political decision-making, particularly on issues that directly affect their daily lives. At the same time, the municipal level tends to receive less attention. Since no major decisions are made there, it often falls below the radar of many political decision makers. This provides Syria with the opportunity to experiment, test new approaches, and advance democracy at the local level with relatively little interference.